Welcome to Oregon Business Matters, a podcast by OBI focused on insights, issues, and initiatives that impact Oregonians' shared prosperity and the state's economic health. I'm your host, Angela Wilhelms, president of OBI. Today we have a true public servant joining us to talk about his experience in the military, on the bench, and in the legislature, and maybe we'll even get him to talk about his time as a children's book author. It is my pleasure to introduce the smart, funny, and committed state senator from Powell Butte, Oregon, Mike McLane.
Thank you, Angela. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I must say this is a fabulous studio you have.
Thank you. The side table in my office.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, well, we're nothing if not efficient here at OBI.
Very efficient.
But thank you for coming over from the Capitol, a little breather from the halls of the building.
Thank you. It's lively today. We had a protest outside, and I had to ask what it was, but one of my staff members said it was protesting arms sales to the Philippines. And I missed it, but I'm looking forward to seeing that on the news.
Yeah, well, there's always something going on at the Capitol, that is for sure.
Something.
Well, before we talk more about the Capitol, which we will do when we get to this year's session, can you just talk a little bit about your background? I try to be brief. It won't be easy because you have such a storied career and an interesting one, but I want our listeners to know a little bit about you, your legal career, military career, your history in Central Oregon, before we get started.
Well, I grew up in Condon, Oregon, and that's where I graduated high school, went to Oregon State University, studied agriculture resources and economics. I met my wife there, my college sweetheart, Holly Craig. She was the FFA state president in high school, first female state president, so she was kind of a big deal. And so we got married, and then I went off to law school, graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School, and clerked for Mick Gillette, justice on the Oregon Supreme Court. From there, went to a large law firm, Stoll Reeves in Portland. Then I took time off, did the book thing where we created educational curriculum called Flying Rhinoceros, but products. And then I moved to Central Oregon to raise the family and practice law there. And after 9/11, I did join the National Guard and as a JAG military lawyer, and I'm still serving there. So I've done varied things in law, both in private practice and in public service.
Including some time on the bench.
I did. I went to the bench in 2019, and I was being considered for a federal bench appointment and decided to take the appointment to the state court by Governor Brown. It was in Crook County, Jefferson County, so local, and I got some great experience. I didn't make it to the bench, and despite my efforts, the President chose the more qualified candidate. So obviously my political connections weren't as good as I thought. But in all seriousness, Judge Hunsaker went to the Ninth Circuit. She's an excellent judge. And so I stayed on the bench, and then the world changed. Between COVID and the social justice riots, cancel culture, January 6th, I just came to the conclusion that this decade was the most impactful of my lifetime, and we were going to make decisions, and I wanted to be a part of that. And you can't be an advocate when you're on the bench. So I went back to advocacy and went back to my law firm and have been advocating for those who have been on the receiving end of abuse of power, both in the workplace and others where. And I just get frustrated, frankly, with a lot of the government overreach and pushing. So I'm pushing back. I represent some businesses in Central Oregon and Portland and the like. So was very happy doing that when the Senate position opened up, and I decided to run for the Senate and won.
So you ran for the Senate and won, and that was after you'd been sort of on a little bit of a break from the legislature. You'd served previously. Talk a little bit about how the legislature is the same or even different now that you're in your second stint in the Capitol.
I served 5 terms in the House, and 3 of those terms was the House Republican leader. And I think My experience in the Senate is that it's quieter, and I'm not the leader of the caucus. And so my tasks are, I'm freed up to focus on my committees and frankly, the areas that I have a sense of urgency about, which is why I ran the rule of law, food security, and then the third is the budget competition. So, I would say that I haven't found it to be, the brutally partisan. I do think that there is neglect of the minority, and that not every chair of committee, and I think this is the same way in the House. Some chairs invite input from minority members, and some don't. And that's how most of the bills, well, all the bills are worked in the committees. And so I think my experience is that there are a lot more problems, frankly, with the budget than there was when I was serving in the House. Now, initially, I was in the House, and in 2011, when we had to reduce budgets, it was the tail end of the Great Recession. So it feels a little bit like that now.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about where we're at in the session. We're about halfway through at the time we're recording this podcast, which means policy bills are working their way through now the second chamber. But the budget conversation still hasn't really heated up yet. It's kind of ramping up, waiting for the next forecast. What do you expect to really be focused on in these next few weeks, and then fast forward to the final few weeks of session?
The budget has hesitation from our leadership about putting it together, and they've developed the budget framework. And frankly, I think a lot of the majority party members are uncertain about what's going to happen at the federal level. At initial impression, you could say that President Trump's administration with regards to tariffs and other things have created this uncertainty. But the reality is, whether it's this session or the next or the one after, there's going to be a reduction at the federal level in money that flows to the state net of inflation because of the budget deficit that has created $36.7 trillion of debt. When you look at our demographics and where that money is baked in as far as the budget acceleration, if we don't do anything, it could accelerate to $50 trillion by the end of this decade. So the alarms have been sounding, and we cannot sustain this level of debt. And the deficit at the federal level in its annual budgets or, the continuing resolutions is not addressing the problem. So President Trump is trying to at least cull out what is low-hanging fruit and some of the waste. Now, I know part of his plan has been to put a halt to grants until they can be vetted, and there's other type of federal money transfers that have been stalled. That has made Oregon, like all states, have to say, okay, if we don't get this or if it's late, how do we backfill? Do we reduce services? What do we do? And when you add that to the budget in Oregon, which is built on income tax, we're stalled out and waiting for the May 15th forecast to say what's our projected income off income taxes. And so in a lot of ways, this uncertainty has created an opportunity for some discussions with Democratic leaders behind the scenes to say, okay, do you appreciate that, okay, we can get through this budget cycle, but what's coming? We're ill prepared for it.
So on that, I want to ask you a question. One of the things we're watching closely as we move forward is the shift in approach that the state economist is taking and how that office forecasts revenue. And it's been widely publicized. The economist himself has talked about it, how they're going to start taking a slightly less conservative approach toward revenue with the goal of mitigating the chance that there's a kicker refund, that we exceed anticipated revenue by a large amount, and it goes back to taxpayers. Anytime you shift risk, there's a flip side, so you might mitigate the opportunity for kickers. But one thing we're concerned about is you're then increasing the risk that there's a shortfall, that you end up assuming you're going to have more revenue and budgeting to a number and then falling short of it. You've been in the legislature when budget rebalancing has needed to happen mid-biennium. You were in the House when the Ways and Means leaders really took some positive steps forward around establishing strong savings accounts. How do you think about that risk, and how would you advise the chairs of the committee to plan for that possibility of more likely deficits as opposed to kickers?
I don't believe the governor or the Democratic leaders despise anything more than the kicker. I mean, and I say that facetiously, but in a way, they look at that revenue and say, why can't we use that? People were taxed at the rate they knew they were going to be taxed in, et cetera. Thank God for the kicker being in the Constitution, it's required. And by the state economists changing projections, what it means is the May 15th forecast may be more robust than perhaps the previous economists would have done. By creating, in essence, it's like doing a trapeze with no net, right? That if there's any mistake, there's going to be pain. And I think that's what Oregon's on the road for. So it means having to come back in special session and reduce budgets. Of course, nobody likes reductions, but ultimately we have a spending problem, and correspondingly we have a revenue problem to the extent that our estimates are telling us we don't. And so the combination of which is a high likelihood of a special session to address the revenue shortfall, if it does occur. I know that the ending balance becomes a key, and ending balances are those things at the end of the budget that we don't spend and prepare for any sort of reduction. We'll see if our Democratic leaders buy into having an ending balance. I know the governor's recommended budget had very little ending balance. I think if we're wise, we'll have a robust one to prepare.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in addition to being part of that budget setting process and the Ways and Means process, you serve on other policy committees and obviously have other interests. What are a couple things you want to see the legislature accomplish from a policy standpoint this session, and do you think they're going to happen?
There are some good bills in the midst of it, and there are some bad bills. A lot of the bad bills, if you will, are bottled up in the rules committees because they didn't have the votes to get out of policy committees, so they sent them to rules. So we'll see what happens in June. I'd like to see some basics like county fair funding, which isn't flashy, but for years there was, a deal struck where the county fairs would be funded at a certain percentage of the lottery funds. The legislature's not lived up to that deal. And what we find, our county fairs have infrastructure that's aging and needs some support, but that county fairs aren't just about fairs. They're also part of a resiliency plan when any sort of disaster hits, be it wildfire or floods or et cetera. Our county fairgrounds are the places where we stage first responders. People often go there for temporary housing, and we're finding more and more uses of county fairs for these, in essence, emergency type of shelters and operations. And so it's time we lived up to our word and fund that. That's House Bill 780 or Senate Bill 780. And there's other good policy bills out there. I happen to think the wolf compensation bill is a good bill, Senate Bill 777, which in essence compensates ranchers who lose cattle in the way that it's a more true sense of their economic loss as opposed to the one-off here, one-off there. A lot of debates about it, but the fact is the people of Oregon chose to introduce wolves back into the wild, and that's caused economic losses for ranchers. Let's pay them. Pay them what is a fair representation of their loss. There's bills like that. There's at a certain point we're going to be address wildland firefighting funds, and that used to be a general fund appropriation. has been since statehood. But now the governor and Democratic leaders want that off the general fund, at least to a certain extent. So there's that debate. I'm not sure how that's going to go, but I would expect Oregonians should be interested in that, and that's a debate that's going to happen probably in June. And I think that's very important because the question isn't whether we pay for fire suppression and relief for folks. The question is this a general fund appropriation? When you have a general fund that I believe has happened over the last 20 years, undergone mission creep, where we're now funding things we never even heard of before. And I could give you many examples. That general fund amount available to do traditional funding, like fire suppression, dwindles. Now they want new taxes for that. Or they want to assess, a bottle bill 5-cent fee to just... These are the types of discussions that we're having because of the mission creep of our state government and funding so many services we never used to fund. We need to have that debate.
Yeah. Well, sounds like there's going to be no shortage of topics to unpack in the final weeks of
there will be
of session. That's you will remain busy right up until the very end. We have time for just one more question, I think, and I'd like to know what keeps you up at night. I mean, you touched on some important issues. You've talked about some big picture and some very specific policy issues, but what keeps you up at night, either because it's a challenge you're not sure how we're going to wrestle with, or because it's an opportunity that you think we need to take advantage of and we're not yet doing that?
I wouldn't say that it's an acute insomnia, but there certainly is a ongoing concern and, frankly, a sense of urgency that I have that Oregon is ill-prepared for what's going to happen over the next 10 years with the federal budget. Our whole economy has been used to this infusion of federal spending. The states have taken on services that they probably wouldn't have done, but they have been encouraged to by federal matches and certainly payments sometimes as high as 90%. When you have to reduce, I mean, think about this. The federal deficit is, as far as historic levels as a percentage of our GDP, is very high. Our national debt can be serviced and will likely be serviced in the long time by inflation. But you have to control the deficit and get it back down to maybe, say, 3% GDP. But people don't realize that the solution in the long term for the government is absolutely painful to folks on fixed incomes, folks who are working 2 jobs and not getting by well. That's coming. So that's a federal deficit / debt that's dealt with by consideration. If we don't do something, we're going to be dealing with it at a crisis, and then it becomes very painful. I put it in context of this. When Ron Wyden went to Congress 44 years ago, the national debt was under $1 trillion. And now it's 36.7 with no end in sight. So I'd love to throw a massive party on your credit card, Angela. I'd love to spend whatever I can on your credit card. But when you pass our children and grandchildren that debt load,
yeah,
it's a disservice. It endangers our reserve currency status. There's a whole host of problems. And we've got to face the fact that this generation, our current generation, must give our children and grandchildren the ability to navigate the next century by getting our fiscal house in order. Yeah. And that's going to have real consequences for Oregon. Now, our governor is not prepared for this. The legislative leadership are not prepared for this. You can only look in the face of so many people with blank stares to realize there's no plan.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about a lot here at OBI is how the revenue committees meet quarterly. You mentioned the May 15 revenue forecast. The revenue committees meet quarterly to accept a revenue forecast report from the state economist because, we don't want to go more than 3 months at a time without understanding how much revenue we're going to be collecting from people over the next 10 years or so. But we don't take that same long-term view approach when we budget. And we really need to start thinking about that, not budgeting just for the current biennium, but for that 10, 20-year look, so that we're prepared in making sustainable budget decisions.
Well, we need to also realize that over the last 10 years or more, that Speaker Kotek, when she was in the House, and her colleagues passed a plethora of workplace regulations and rules. You can go through the list and you could say, was that good or bad? Well, it's done. And it raised the cost of operating the government, let alone operating businesses, right? So we've been on this train where we thought it wouldn't end. And so costs have gone up. Those are self-inflicted costs. And you can isolate this program, pay equity, scheduling. You can look at any of these programs in isolation. And you can say, but what about this? What about this? What about this? The but what about argument, and where your empathy is invoked. And so Oregon has been making these decisions repeatedly every 2 years, and costs have gone up, and the cost of government has gone up. And now they're coming back and saying, hey, if we don't have this general fund appropriation, we're going to have to cut. We're going to, these kids won't be served, or these folks won't be served. So in order for this current leadership, I get it, Oregon put one party in charge of every facet of government in Oregon. How is that one party going to have to now contract government services?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's politically possible for them. My goal at being a Republican is to roll up my sleeves and help, not to sit back and throw rocks, because, there's plenty targets, right? But if all folks, whether they're on the west side of the Cascades or the east side of the Cascades in their communities, deserve to have a government that is efficient and lives within its means. And so the argument is, well, we have to balance our budget. Well, if the only way you can balance our budget, at least under Oregon law, is to continually, perpetually raise taxes, right? You're not living within your means.
No.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then we think, oh my God, our population is shrinking. Why?
Yeah, nope. It's a very good point, and it's part of why we're continually arguing to get Oregon's competitiveness back economically, so that we can grow jobs, make people economically prosperous as individuals and wage earners, but also, the private sector ultimately generates the money that gets sent to the government for taxes. So
that's true.
We want to come at it from that. So we're here to help you help them, and we're here to help them directly in those conversations. They're big ones. So as always seems to be the case on this podcast, we could talk with you for hours, but we promised a relatively short form podcast to our listeners, so we'll have to bring it home. But is there anything else you'd like to share with folks before we sign off?
Well, the one thing I'd say is engage. Do so to the best of your ability. It's very easy now to testify online and to let folks know what you believe, but the most boring part of our government, some would say, is our budget. And frankly, that's the point that needs input. We need to hear from folks that run businesses, that are the ATM, right? As we always kid our Democratic colleagues, is saying business is more than just an ATM for the program that you want to launch. Without a robust economy, we cannot support these services. I hope folks that are running businesses, that are working, whether you're, at an entry level or a management level, engage and let the state elected officials know what the impacts really are to you. That's the thing that I hope most people take away, is we've got to do this now. The old adage, kicking the can down the road, we're out of road.
That is very good advice. So with that, Thank you, Senator Mike McLane. It is always an honor and a joy to chat with you.
Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for tuning in to Oregon Business Matters. You can visit OregonBusinessIndustry.com for more information, including a resources page on how to follow Senator McLane's advice to engage with the legislature. I hope you are well. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.